two prior occasions, we here at Cultaholic have regaled you with some truly mesmerizing stories about the lives of professional wrestlers on the road and the crazy predicaments that they find themselves in. And wouldn't you know it, there's enough ammunition in the arsenal to create a third installment of wacky wrestling road stories. If you opened up your YouTube app in search of a hearty dose of Graps-related insanity, this is your lucky day. There's just something compelling about these kinds of tales, isn't there? The charming miscreants that entertain millions with their over-the-top exploits are possibly even more entertaining when the cameras aren't on them. Rental car mayhem, hotel hijinks, intoxicated zaniness, and the trouble that people get into when they're rendered bored and listless by never-ending travel have been staples of some of pro wrestling's most unbelievable stories. Many of them fall into the realm of you can't make this stuff up, and judging by the plane of surreality they exist on, you really can't. So sit back, get comfy, and press onward with us as we share the stories ahead. Just try not to worry your mind with the troubling moral implications and what-ifs of these little yarns. That just takes the fun out of it. I'm Adam Pachisi from Cultaholic.com, and these are 10 crazy wrestling road stories that defy reality. Join us. Number 10, Bedtime Snack. Mick Foley, Diamond Dallas Page, and Steve Austin. Today they are three certified wrestling legends, but in the early 90s, they were a trio of WCW mid-carders, each with potential to spare. The three were also good friends, but weren't above messing with each other for the sake of a cheap laugh. Ha! Got it! For instance, Foley recalls a time traveling together when a wound-up, irritated DDP was on the verge of losing it. So he and Austin chose to comfort their friend as best they could. Just kidding, they made a bet on how long it would take for them to make Page snap. The masterstroke came in the form of a plate of homemade cookies that a generous fan had given the wrestlers. With an annoyed Page not present in the hotel room, Foley and Austin covertly dumped the sweets between his bedsheets and waited for the magic to happen. When the yoga master went to bed that night, he began contorting, then angrily muttering about there being effing cookies in his bed. Foley was pretending to be asleep, but couldn't mask his laughter, so an angry Page, who apparently slept in the nude, dove into Foley with a handful of cookies and began grinding them into Mick, who was more annoyed by DDP's naked body being on top of him. Frankly, it's not clear who the real victim was here. Number 9, Where the Hell Am I? In the days before GPS and other electronical navigational aids, it's somewhat amazing that wrestlers working for national promotions didn't get lost more often than they did. But wrestlers did indeed get lost, one of whom was the enforcer Arn Anderson. But in Double A's case, he didn't get lost traveling by car through some unfamiliar city, he simply woke up in an unrecognizable room and had no idea where he was. Tony Schiavone remembers the particulars as he, Anderson, and announcer David Crockett were hanging out in a Chicago watering hole when suddenly an inebriated Arn just passed out. The two broadcasters then took on the daunting task of carrying the sunken heavyweight into a cab and to the Chicago Marriott, where Crockett signed them in, while Schiavone held a blacked out Arn upright behind a large plant to avoid prying eyes. They got Arn into his room and frustratedly threw him down onto his bed, not even leaving him a note. So when Anderson finally came to, he had no clue where the hell he was and why he was all alone, so he understandably freaked the frig out. Schiavone did admit that, hindsight being 2020, they probably should have left a note. Number 8, Driven Crazy. Andre the Giant was a star attraction around the globe, and promoters from territories near and far were eager to book the 8th wonder of the world. He made a number of forays into Calgary's Stampede Wrestling, and this particular tale takes place in the late 70s. Following his Stampede appearance in Calgary, Andre's next match was to take place in Butte, Montana, and Smith Hart, the oldest of the 12 Hart siblings, was tasked with getting Andre to the airport. Unfortunately though, Andre's flight was cancelled. While Andre was fine with missing one booking, Smith was determined to get the Giant there. He found a seat on another flight, but the airport was 40 minutes away and the plane took off in 20. That's when Smith, with young Brett in the passenger seat and Andre in the back, gunned it to the airport at over 100 miles an hour through the city, and even made a sharp curve into the airport with the car up on 2 wheels, all while Andre and Brett screamed bloody murder. The two Harts were nearly arrested for the escapade, but Brett, whose fault this wasn't, managed to talk their way out of it. According to the hitman, Andre never forgave Stu Hart for having Smith be his chauffeur. Number 7, Demon Hotel. By all accounts, Glenn Jacobs is a pretty good dude. The fact that he's a shade under 7 feet tall and looks like he could rip your internal organs out with his bare hands made him the ideal choice to play Kane. That's the fun contradiction of Jacobs. He physically fits into just about any horror movie monster role, but is otherwise articulate, well-spoken, and peaceable. A fat lot of good those latter qualities are to people who know nothing about him except how he looks on the outside. In a rush to get out of an arena one night, a tired and agitated Kane threw on his workout attire, not even bothering to clean off the shadowy mascara he wears beneath his mask. With his long mane of hair askew, he checked in at a hotel and ventured up to his room. Jacobs then ploughed into the room where he was a little surprised to find an older couple sitting on the bed. The mere sight of 7-foot Kane in this dirty, dishevelled state, and him being too exhausted to reassure them that he wasn't some homicidal maniac, sent the couple into a screaming panic as they hugged each other, probably fearing their time was near. Muttering under his breath, Kane just left them to their bedwetting terror, went back to the front desk, and asked for another room. Number 6. Violent Storm. Professional wrestling ribs can be hilarious, and the more elaborate, the better. Longtime TNA star Cowboy James Storm apparently pulled off a doozy of a prank on Rhino one time while the two were traveling with Billy Gunn through Jackson, Tennessee. It just so happens that Storm's brother is a police officer in the city, and Storm claims that they look nothing like one another. That's the key to the rib ahead, because it kept Rhino from figuring out that he was being had. With the man-beast at the wheel, Storm's brother pulled the car over and began asking Rhino some questions that the anxious wrestler didn't answer clearly enough for his liking. Storm then turned on Rhino and told his brother that while Rhino hadn't been drinking, he was on steroids. A stunned Rhino was then subjected to a field sobriety test. Then, when Storm added that Rhino had a gun in the car, Brother Cop reached for his taser before handcuffing the ECW original. And then, while Rhino's freaking out, Storm bolts from the car and knocks out his brother before telling Rhino, "Let's get out of here, we'll rip the camera out of his car and they'll never know it was us." That's when a completely horrified Rhino ran off into the woods, presumably still handcuffed. Number 5. Nervous Shakedown. The Kliq was a rather interesting quintet. You had Paul Levesque, who lived life sober as a judge, and then the other 4, who all enjoyed their indulgences, shall we say, to varying degrees. As Kevin Nash describes it, Triple H was usually the wheelman of the group when out together, and was driving the van when the 5 rolled into a restaurant parking lot in Indianapolis one night. Nash claims that all but Hunter had been drinking, and some had somas in their system. When the Kliq walked, or staggered, into the restaurant, they realized that there were 24 cops patronizing the place, so they tried to play it cool as Hunter was dispatched back to the vehicle to hide all the open containers. Nash remembers the cops giving them looks, and when 123 Kid began trembling from the somas kicking in, Scott Hall quickly got him back to the van. When the meal was finished, Shawn Michaels himself began going into the shakes and needed Nash's help getting him out. That's when the presiding officers had seen enough and were prepared to arrest the entire Kliq. Nash claims that as they were handcuffing Shawn, he explained away HBK's shakes by saying that Michaels had epilepsy. Thus, Michaels got an ambulance ride to the hospital instead of a squad car ride to jail, thereby sparing the Kliq from becoming headline fodder. Number 4. Bored to Tears. We tend to throw an innocent story or two into videos like these just as a little palate cleanser, you know? And this story in particular begins innocently enough, with a friendly comment from a friendly wrestler not knowing the trouble he was about to incur. Hacksaw Jim Duggan and a troupe of other WWE wrestlers went on a tour of Italy in 1988, and the trouble began when Duggan checked in his trusty 2x4 at customs. Duggan carried the board in a special case made for him by his father-in-law, which he admits looks like it could carry a deadlier weapon. At the airport in Italy, the agent began inspecting the case's contents, perhaps thinking the board was hollowed out and being used to smuggle something illicit. When the customs agent questioned Duggan about what the board was for, he joked, "I'm building a house over here, piece by piece." Not only did the agent not laugh, he forced Duggan to sit in a chair by a nearby wall for 2 hours. Duggan repeatedly apologized for the good-natured comment, but 2 whole hours passed before they finally let him leave. Meanwhile, the irritated wrestlers on the bus, they too had to wait 2 hours by the way, proceeded to curse Duggan out when he climbed aboard. Number 3. Shredded Beef. As stories have indicated through the years, many of them involving our Lord and Saviour Haku, certain civilians love to try and test the might of heavyweight wrestlers and wind up paying dearly for it. This story starts off more playful, but nearly resulted in a catastrophic injury for a young Brutus Beefcake. While touring New Japan in the early 80s with Dick Murdoch, the two Americans were indulging merrily at one night spot, enjoying heaps of good food and alcohol on their sponsor's dime. The suds were flowing and a good time was being had by all. As Beefcake recalls, a few of the sponsors had a little too much to drink and wanted to get physical, which Beefcake laughingly obliged, seeing as he was much larger than they were. He agreed to take on 3 of them collectively in an arm wrestling match and had enough resistance strength to keep all 3 from leveraging his limb downward. But when one of the sponsors fell off the pile, Beefcake's resistance quickly worked against him, and in a flash, his arm went forward, smashing through the glass table, sending blood everywhere. Fortunately for Beefcake, the wounds to his arm were only flesh deep, though New Japan did pull him from the remainder of the tour. Number 2, just add water. For this entry, we are going to have to use some euphemisms, because while it's incredibly funny, it's also sordid AF. Like many wild wrestling tales, this one begins with boredom, as well as a bit of creative experimentation. While holed up in Florida for a spate of WCW TV tapings, Raven and Perry Saturn decided to add a rather adult slant to a classic children's toy with the aid of 2 volunteers and a hotel hallway, as well as some unmentionable props. The two invited a pair of strippers to their room, but the fun took place outside the rooms, as they laid down a long section of tarp. After disassembling the bathroom sink and fashioning a hose to it, they created an indoor slip and slide. Sounds cute and innocent, until you realise that one of the ladies was sitting at the end of the tarp, while Saturn slid toward her with, shall we say, a tubular massager strapped to his head. Certainly, this wasn't the way Whammo intended for slip and slides to be used. Things took a turn for the worse when Saturn wasn't getting enough velocity from Raven pushing him, so they used a fire extinguisher to try and generate thrust, leading to the obvious gagging hazard from the extinguisher, not the other thing. When the rooms beneath them began flooding from the expanse of water, security was called in and the entire WCW roster was kicked out. Gee, thanks a lot, guys. Number 1, Death Race 1989. Speaking of WCW and boredom, this just takes us to a tale where somebody, if not multiple people, should have probably died, and let's just be grateful that nobody did. As Paul Heyman revealed, the Steiner brothers and Sting had this crazy thing they would do on the road where, while Sting drove, they would pull up to another vehicle of wrestlers. Rick Steiner would then dangle out of the open car window with Scott holding his legs, and then try to open the door of the speeding car next to them just to screw with the occupants in the other vehicle. First off, Jesus Christ. They tried this exact stunt in North Carolina to a vehicle containing Heyman and the Samoan SWAT team of Samu and Fatu, but Heyman made sure his door was locked. Unsatisfied, Sting pulled ahead of Heyman's car and the Steiners apparently began throwing produce and other objects at Heyman's vehicle. Swearing revenge, Samu and Fatu made Heyman pull over at a convenience store where the heavyweights brought up a ton of their own projectiles, then went hunting for the babyface trio. Back on the road, they caught up to Sting's side and suddenly it was a fight to the death on the highway, looking like the Ben-Hur chariot race meets Mad Max Fury Road as the objects went flying. Heyman's rental car was in such bad shape from the accumulated damage that he is no longer allowed to rent a vehicle in the state of North Carolina.